Hello and welcome to the Play Creators Conference, and this is the Playing with Brands panel session. I'm Ian Downs from Start Licensing, and for this session I'm delighted to be joined by Susie Lecker, who is an experienced executive in the toys and licensing space, who most recently served as EVP of Global Licensing at Spin Master. We're also very lucky to be joined by Stephanie Griggs, who's the Creative Director at the Roald Dahl company, and Jennifer Tan, Creative Director of Consumer Products at Pixar Animation Studios. And today's kind of panel, Playing with Brands, is designed to kind of get a conversation going about how toy companies and brand owners, IP owners, meet in the middle, how toy development and the creative process goes. And what we're aiming to do is to try to give you a little bit of an insight from these experienced panelists, so that next time you have the chance to talk to a toy company or an intellectual property owner, there may be some of the remarks and advice that come from today's chat that might be useful for you. So the first thing that I'm going to do is ask each member of the panel just to tell us a little bit about themselves and their background, so that you can understand their experience and how they're looking at things in the toy and game and licensing space. So if I turn to Susie, first of all, Susie, if you could just give us a little overview of your background and experience, and then we'll talk to the others as well about that. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. My background and experience, I started my career in marketing and worked for a baked goods company where I actually did do some licensing. We licensed Weight Watchers to make breads for them. Biggest baked goods company in Canada. I'm Canadian, and then moved into health and beauty, and then found my way to toys, working for Mattel Canada. I won't tell you when because it will date me, and I like to say I have 20 years at Mattel, so I started when I was 10. But I started at Mattel Canada working on the girls portfolio, moved into preschool, and that's where I first picked up licenses in licensed preschool. And then I made a move to New York City office, which was all licensed preschool, and was the international marketing. So a lot of experience working with customers all around the world and working with the licensors and the agents. And I guess I have a little bit of a masochistic streak because I do enjoy the complexity of working on the licensed properties. There is, there's more constituents to vote on everything, but kind of understanding the agent structure, the local structures, what broadcast networks are best for properties. I really got a lot of training in that over 6 or 7 years, both domestically and internationally, working on licensed preschool. Then I made a move to LA with Mattel and picked up Girls, and Princess was part of that portfolio. And that was right at when Princess and the Frog launched, and it exploded the business. We tripled the business over the course of the next couple of years with the help of movies like Tangled and long, beautiful golden hair, which is a lovely play pattern. And from there, I went back to New York to run that office, and picked up working with the design team as well as marketing and engineering and the whole kind of a general management role. And was really introduced then to the inventor community, and have a very keen appreciation for that, because we certainly wouldn't have had as many successful Doras or Elmos or whoever you pick the character of the year without the inputs from the inventor community. And then after New York, I moved to Montreal to help integrate the mega business. So I've had experience across girls, boys, construction, games, kind of every category, every geography that you can have in toys from a toy manufacturing perspective. I have that. And then finally moved back to LA to head up the toy box division. That was where we had kind of everything that wasn't a core brand. So it was all the games, construction business, everything licensed, whether it was infant, preschool, every age range, and every kind of category. Once again, more of a kind of, it was chief brands officer, but really managing design and marketing. And I actually had an innovation team, and the inventor team was part of my team. So a lot of exposure and experience from that. And then I left Mattel at the end of 2017, and I took a bit of time off and then went to Spin Master as their head of global licensing they were, had just kind of come into their own in terms of getting some of the bigger properties in-house, and had a lot of experience managing the bigger studio licensors, but also with the advent of streaming and digital, and properties come from everywhere, and so more and more the walls are breaking down in terms of what's content. It's not just a TV series anymore, and so really kind of having a mandate to find properties across the spectrum, and so that's kind of my experience in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you very much, Susie. That's that's a substantial amount of experience, which I'm sure will be very informative as we go on with the chat. So if I could just ask Stephanie maybe to just give us her kind of resume. And I know obviously we know each other from your work with Roald Dahl, which is fascinating, but you could just tell us a bit more about your background before Roald Dahl.
Yeah, so I fell into licensing, as I know many people do, out of nowhere about 7 years ago, when I joined Sanrio to work on the Mr. Men Little Miss brand. And previous to that, I'd actually come from a design background. So the last role that I'd had before I joined Sanrio was working within Top Man's in-house design team, creating graphics for apparel. And so I was kind of thrown into this new world of licensing, which I absolutely loved. So I worked on the Mr. Men brand for a while, and I left there as brand manager in 2015 to set up the licensing department for the Roald Dahl Story Company, which included building out toy and game as a category within that, but they hadn't had a sort of in-house licensing department before. So naturally, I brought my design skill set sort of with me, and my job role kind of morphed over the years to heading up both the licensing and the design teams. So as licensing and design director, which was great to kind of have both heads on, very much both creative and commercial, which I really like, kind of mixing both worlds. And then most recently, so I came back from maternity leave this March in a new role as creative director, where so now I manage our very busy in-house design team, fulfilling and sort of building graphic and illustrative content to support all of our departments within the Roald Dahl Story Company. So marketing, partnerships, licensing, theatre, entertainment, across many sub-brands that sit under the umbrella of Roald Dahl. So stories like Matilda, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, BFG, Twits. So yeah, that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. And I'm a kind of, even though I'm probably now described as a veteran of licensing, I do remember as a child and to my own children how fond we all were of Roald Dahl and his stories and characters. So I can imagine that's a fascinating job and a very rewarding opportunity, and be interesting later to sort of find out a bit more about how you've brought that alive in the toy and games world. And Jennifer, if we may just turn to you, and if you could just give us a little overview of your current position and your recent background, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Ian. And it's so nice to meet you, Susie and Stephanie, over the Zoom internet. So yeah, I started off I actually went to toy design school at FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. I just really wanted to learn something creative, and toy design seemed like this perfect little obscure study. So I went there, and I did do some internships and at Fisher Price at Sesame Workshop in New York. After school, I landed a job at Disney Consumer Products in Glendale, California, and worked on a bunch of Disney properties, and ended up working on Toy Story 3 when the movie came out, and developed a really great interest at Pixar Animation Studios. But most of my work had then been from the licensor's perspective. So I wanted to try and explore what it would be like in the licensee at a toy company and really kind of, learn a little bit more about how to make a toy from start to finish. So I left Disney and started a job at Spin Master, where I worked on a few in-house properties where Susie is now. And I did work on the Monsters University program, actually, when they scored that master license from Pixar. And after that, I moved up here to the Bay Area and worked, and here currently in my current position, at Pixar Animation Studios as Director of Consumer Products. We have a pretty small team of about 8 people. Right now we have 7 people, but mostly to make sure that we're having strong relationships with all our licensees across all product categories. And we work really closely with Disney and all our, and Mattel and all our different licensees around the globe. Yeah, mostly featuring, working on feature films, and as well as all the old legacy films, and bringing them back to life through all different types of product categories, whether it's soft lines or hard lines, home goods, along with Disney Store and merchandise at Disney parks.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So, I mean, it's very clear that all of you have obviously great experience and insight into how the toy and licensing world comes together. Thinking about, from my own perspective, having worked in licensing, I don't want to say, but more than 25 years now, I think one of the interesting aspects when you have, let's say, a toy company and a licensee, a licensor who owns the rights, and they come together to create licensed products. And I'll ask Stephanie about this first of all, is how do you sort of set out to make sure that there is a kind of a happy partnership there, and there's a good balance between those partners, so that, I suppose in a nutshell, how do you sort of set about that they work and both parties have a voice and there's a partnership and there isn't a sort of a tension in the creative process? So Stephanie, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that first of all.
Yeah, yes, good question. I think in my experience, striking a sort of mutually respective balance at the earliest stage in the process really benefits both parties. I think the licensor should always be in control of how their IP is used, and that making sure that the end audience is right, making sure that those checks are kind of done throughout the process. Whereas the licensee is obviously the expert in their field, and any product development related points and limitations should really be listened to by the licensor. So kind of making sure that nobody's in charge per se, but there's that balance of respect. Equally though, I do think there can be some kind of surprising exceptions where a partnership or a product execution is more heavily led by a retailer or a licensee who might have a specific project in mind, and they know exactly the creative, the audience, the product that they want to do. They've thought of everything, and in that case it can sometimes be a yes or a no from the licensor based on whether they agree with that, and whether there's obviously any tweaks that need to go on within that. But that's also quite an exciting sort of exception where it's not just the licensor saying, this is what you can do, or this is what the best thing to do with our IP is. And another kind of party that I think is also really vital is the retailer. And if they can be involved at the earliest relevant point too, to sort of secure listings, guide what their customer and the consumer is more likely to purchase, and even possibly negotiate an exclusivity angle, then that can also be really beneficial as well. And kind of rather than doing the whole product development process and then taking it to a retailer and kind of hoping that that works for the retailer, getting them involved in the process earlier. And then within that, obviously the ideal outcome is where everyone's happy with the final sales and the product. So yeah, I think a really careful balance, basically.
That's very helpful. And Susie, in your experience, where you've kind of worked, I guess, on both sides, where you've been in a sort of a licensor situation, but also a toy company situation, and in licensing, a lot of people talk about partnership and, you know, successful partnerships. Do you sort of share and echo a lot of what Stephanie said in terms of achieving the balance? Is it about good communication, or is there's more to it than that, I guess?
Yeah, no, I think Stephanie hit the nail on the head, that there's, I think where we had the most success is when, you know, we always used to say things like, your brand is our brand. You know, there's not a distinction and a line between ownership, because yes, you get to make the final call because you're the licensor, but we're not going to treat it like we rent it. We treat it like we own it. And so that's an important kind of starting point from a partnership perspective. I think that the other piece that I would just add in from a marketing perspective is that it depends on where you are in the life cycle of the brand. There's times when a licensor has very hard and fast and rigid rules, but the brand may already be in kind of a mature life cycle and can stretch beyond. And I think of things that, you know, we both owned and we licensed a brand like Thomas when I was at Mattel. So first we were the licensee, and that was a very established brand that's very iconic and people really know what that's about. And so the licensor at the time, you know, was very protective of the property, and everything had to stay very core and very central. And then when we bought the brand, where we saw the opportunity was to say, you know what, this brand can withstand, there's not a lot we could do to ruin it, right? So it can withstand some creative interpretation. And we broke open a little bit of the rules as a toy manufacturer coming at a license versus a licensor and a toy manufacturer. So if the brand is in its nascent stages and you're trying to establish what it is, you don't want to mess with those hard and fast rules. But when a brand has evolved past that, the creativity has to get a little bit more open so that you can really stop doing just iterations of the same thing. And kind of break frame to catch, because toys is fun. It's got to be about catching people's imagination, tickling the brain. Yeah. And you can't do that if you stay too hard and fast.
Okay, thank you. And Jennifer, just turning to yourself and sort of developing the point about partnership. Do you have any sort of suggestions or practical experience of how you best kind of run that partnership? I mean, is it you know, if you're working with toy companies, is it a series of kind of meetings? I mean, obviously in today's world, Zoom calls. How do you sort of, from a practical point of view, make sure that that partnership keeps on track and your voice is heard whilst their voice is also achieved, but in a practical way? It'd be interesting to get some practical kind of insight from your experience.
Yeah, I would totally agree with both Stephanie and Susie. I think it truly does need to be a partnership, but there's also room to push certain boundaries because we are involving many different parties for a reason. Everybody's an expert in a different way, and it is about establishing that relationship really early on. It helps because the toy industry is pretty small, so everybody kind of gets to know each other really well, and I think that for example, now I still, you know, I have a lot of different people that I've worked with who are at Mattel, who are at Spin Master, who are at all these different companies, and having that relationship is great to have and to begin with. But I think establishing a clear process and expectations, you know, really early on, and lots of well, maybe not lots of meetings, but frequent meetings, you know, weekly check-ins maybe in the beginning, and then kind of going into monthly, or just, you know, making sure to have a clear you know, process of communication. I know for us, the biggest projects for us are the feature films, and we often start very early, right? 12 to 18 months before the film is released. And so at that point, a lot of times the filmmakers are still developing their characters. They're still developing the story. So a lot of things are unknown or in progress. So it's very important to keep a close relationship with the filmmakers, but also with the licensees, with Disney, and making sure that everybody's getting the same updates and are aligned in terms of any changes. And you know, and we do often establish like, you know, when it's concept time and time to present the line review, making sure our partners are getting as much material as possible in order to provide them with enough resources to develop like strongest and most compelling product line they can. And when they present, there's you know, it's mostly yeah, just making sure there's room for a lot of creative and conversation and kind of back and forth in terms of what the reasoning behind certain ideas. And then from then on, just, yeah, keeping that communication clear and managing against timelines, because that's often a big issue or a big something that we need to keep in mind of. So we like to ask for a lot of product development timelines and prioritizing certain projects. And so we're getting back to people in a timely manner, and we're not taking too long in getting feedback. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. And sort of touching on one of the points that Jennifer alluded to there, and I'll turn to Susie first about this, is the actual, obviously, licensing in itself in the toy industry is a very competitive space, and you're kind of not the only, forgive the pun, but you're not the only game in town. And so when you come to present to toy companies, what's your sort of advice and experience on how someone who's an IP owner best presents their property to toy companies? And one of the points that I've sort of touched on there, or from Jennifer, was obviously, particularly with film and TV properties, sometimes you're pitching them maybe 2 years ahead of when they come onto screen, and there may be some limits or limitations placed on what you can actually put in the public domain when you're trying to sell to people. So it'd be interesting from all of you to sort of pick up your experience of how you would advise people to present properties to toy companies to ensure that you get a sales pickup and then you're starting the relationship in the best possible way. So Susie, just turning to you first on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think clarity around what your position is in the market as you're coming with whatever this, idea is in whatever stage. Wherever I worked, we always preferred to be brought in early, because very often there is opportunities. So the toy companies are constantly seeing from inventor communities, from their own internal design houses, they're constantly seeing mechanisms and different ideas and ways to create toys that may not marry today with something that we have in the stable of brands in our house. And so the earlier that we can be brought in on a briefing process for a new property, the better. However, you do want to have the skeleton of what it is, and knowing what the essence of the property is and how that's differentiated in the marketplace from what's already in the space that you're going after. And then being open to, those kinds of ideas, seeding the content, not to create a toy commercial out of whatever it is you're developing, but more to say, if we work synergistically, there are things we can tweak without compromising the integrity of the creative of the show, or the movie, or whatever the piece of content is, that actually, allows an opportunity for an amazing, iconic toy that can sell in the millions. And that's, in my experience, where the best toys have come from, is when we've been able to work early. And sometimes it's about the toy people bringing a mechanism to the table and saying, look, this is a great play pattern, and it marries with the kind of core essence of what you're saying your character is. Can we actually have him do this action in the show? Is that something that's possible? And I'll just say quickly about the process, that from a toy lens perspective, we love when a licensor knows that the funnel is wide open for creativity and ideas and input at the beginning of the process. But as we get through the process, it narrows. And so the ability to respond and react, to major shifts, is part of what makes a great partnership, because it's not that you can't. Everything is a question of time and money, but you can't do it on everything. And so, having a partner that understands that, let's get everything on the table as much as we can in the beginning, and bring as many people to the table in the beginning, and then let's kind of narrow that as we get closer and closer to launch, understanding that, we're bringing things in the final stage just for approval on where the eyes are, and, if the whiskers look right, versus it being, oh, we've got to change the price point. So,
okay, thank you. And Stephanie, just turning to yourself, I mean, if I understand it correctly, obviously Roald Dahl properties started off as books, but you've moved them into TV, film, stage shows, etc. And there's a lot of development going on in in the kind of on-screen world now, as I understand it. How easy has it been for you to kind of pull all those things together and marshal those things and present them to the toy community in a kind of timely fashion, in terms of having the assets, but also presenting the story in the way that you wanted to present it, really?
Yeah, I think timelines is definitely a really interesting point around that as well, which we haven't had to work with hugely so far yet, outside of film. Obviously film is very specific around that, so when we did the BFG movie, the licensed program was very time sensitive, but our kind of core license program at the moment is built around Quentin Blake's illustrations, which means that it's heavily linked to publishing and books, so we don't have those time constraints within that strand. In terms of a kind of key selling, I think for us, for the toy category, and actually in general, for depending on what your brand is, there should be that sort of USP and that kind of sweet spot. So what's that sweet spot going to be for the toy company that you're talking to? So for Roald Dahl, our USP is the many kind of narrative streams and the breadth of storytelling possibilities within our properties and within our characters. And so for us, I think if the toy company that we're speaking to or that we work with can see that there's an opportunity for an expansive world, then that's quite an attractive proposition. And so I think, as well as being really clear on that, what your USP is, I think a pitch, if you like, should include vital information on the audience and the demographic, age range, how and where the audience consumes your content. So is it book, film, TV, streaming, digital, and also creative examples as well, so that the toy partner can kind of gauge suitability for their product categories. So, you know, is it 3Dable? Is it going to work for 3D turnarounds? Is it going to work within plush or figurines, or is it actually better for sort of gaming, puzzles? And so on that note as well, I think it's really key that you don't feel the need to force your property into an area or into a box that you know is tricky for your property. So, no, Susie made a great point around kind of letting a licensee sort of really go wild with the creative, and I think that's really important and that's great. But equally, you don't want to be sort of selling in something that you know is really hard, or just being honest about that. And so if there is character artwork limitations or other limitations, or equally there's something that works really well, just giving that insight is kind of crucial at that stage. You know, just being honest, really.
Okay, thank you. And Jennifer, sort of developing some of the things that Susie and Stephanie have touched on, in your experience, have you seen a shift in the sort of requirements from toy companies in terms of how much insight and knowledge they need to have about potential licensed property further out? And does that cause you sort of any anxiety, as it were, in terms of you're in the middle of developing film and TV properties, and they may be evolving, there may be kind of limitations on the information, as we said, that you can impart to people. But have you seen the demands and requirements changing from toy companies, and how have you adapted to cope with those?
Yeah, I definitely feel it changing because, and I totally see the need for sharing story and assets and information about a new film early on, and it has become more of a concrete ask. So we work with Disney to create style guides and branding guides, and usually aim to launch those or to make those available to everyone about 12 months out before the film release. But now it's becoming clear that we need it a little earlier for certain product categories, or for certain products that set either earlier on shelf or they have a longer lead time. And so, yeah, that is a lot of pressure, I think, for our filmmakers who, at Pixar, my team really is the bridge between the filmmakers who are the experts at storytelling, who are telling, their stories and developing their own characters, and then between Disney, but also the licensees who are the experts at making the product and are working against strict timelines in order to make it happen. So yeah, it's a matter of for us really connecting with the filmmakers earlier, and also stressing the importance of getting that information and making them feel comfortable to share it at that stage, and educating them a little bit on why we need it, so early, and so yes, it is it's often that's the kind of big most stressful factor is just ensuring that we are not missing dates or not missing them by too long, and because everyone's super everyone knows like this is our ideal date, but it often is not something that we can always hit, and of course, we don't want to share stuff that's going to change and that's not correct or that doesn't feel authentic to the story. And so we have to kind of wait for when things are truly ready, but balancing how much we share and how much we don't. So, in my point of view, I'm always, trying to push for sharing more and sharing wider, because and with the caveat that things are subject to change, but at least we're allowing people some insight into what we're thinking, and that how characters and stories are evolving, and then just making sure we're updating as things change here and there. So yeah.
Sorry, thank you. And just sort of developing that point a bit further and thinking about some of the people who will be hopefully listening to our podcast in future weeks. They come from the toy inventor and creative kind of communities. And I just wonder, we'll start with Susie, how when you're, let's say, a big international global IP holder, how easy or appropriate is it to sort of build up a relationship with individual inventor companies and individual creative toy designers? Because I'm thinking, particularly from my sort of broad experience of licensing, one of the things that perhaps the licensing misses out on sometimes is innovation and creativity, but obviously there's lots of checks and balances about how you can access that creativity. So I just wondered, from your experience, and we'll go around and ask the other guys as well, how do you marshal that kind of creativity and how do you build up a rapport with the inventor community? So Susie, be interested to hear what you say.
Sure. I mean, I think it's entirely appropriate. I think different companies have different approaches. And to be clear, I'm not working for Spin Master right now. I left at the end of January, so I'm not representing anybody in this dialogue, but myself and my personal opinion. I've worked for long enough in the toy industry that I think I've seen everything. I've seen the teams where there's been a resistance to inventor ideas. We want it invented here. We don't want to have to pay a royalty. Personally, I never understood that. For me, it's it's a mandate as part of providing the best possible consumer experience to get to the most creative interpretation of something. And very often it's a trigger for, it as a collaboration, similar to how we collaborate with a licensor on a property to get the best possible toyetic experience. We can collaborate with an inventor on an idea to get the best possible execution. And I think that there has been an evolution over time where, maybe more old school thinking was, well, we don't want to be very honest and open with the inventor community because we'll have to pay them for something that was, kind of co-created, and we don't want to have to do that. And I think that's really backwards. I think that collaboration, I mean, if anybody proved that, it was Apple, right? Like, you get to more through more people being involved in what you're doing, and iTunes and, musicians and all the rest of it. So you can't actually create magic anymore without collaborating, I think. And so fostering relationships with individual inventors, it is something to manage because there is a lot of inventors out there and a lot of people have great ideas, and there are some houses that are very reputable, and so at Mattel there was kind of a stable of inventors, about 20 or so, that were managed on an ongoing basis, and we provided events to brief them on and bring them into the business as much as we could to have them involved at the outset of our development process and get the best ideas on the table, no matter who it came from. Spin Master works a little bit differently. And while they do that, they also, they'll take an idea to an inventor and say, we don't have time to really, we have a seed of something, we don't have time to really get to this. Can you work on it and see what you come up with? And and so I think that as creatively as you can work with them, with that community, and expand. And I think what, Mojo Nation can help toy companies do is expand the reach in a very practical way. And it's very impractical for a big toy company to try to work with the little guys. Because it's too much to manage on an ongoing basis. And so having some help funneling that and opening up that community beyond who is already in it is going to be vital to help keep it fresh and energetic and delivering those amazing ideas. So.
Okay, thank you. And Jennifer, turning to yourself, I mean, sort of developing that point again further, I mean, given you've got your day job to manage and you've got to get, product from A to B, how easy has it been for you within your role to develop relationships with the inventor community, either individuals or the inventor houses? And is it something that you feel is important as you develop your toy lines over the future?
Yeah, as a licensor, we have less of a direct relationship with inventors. It's mostly through our licensees. But when I was at Spin Master, I know at Spin Master, inventors were embraced, and that kind of innovation was, and rightfully so. I think that, often, especially, being at Pixar and my job role is really like, I mean, it says to, protect the integrity of the characters in the story. It comes with a lot of, weight, but at the same time, I think, as we've talked about, like it's important to also think outside of the box. It's important to allow others to really reinterpret, what our stories and our characters mean for them. And, I know there are sensitivities, as Susie said, about costs that come with, certain inventor items. But I think, like, in my point of view, without, if we are fearful of that, and if we're, we're not taking that risk, then we are essentially taking a risk on creativity and innovation. And I think it's really important to invest in that community, because I've seen so many, I think that we can easily be stuck in the same kind of line structures and the same cookie cutter ideas, for every single property, because we know that that works, but every property is also different. And sometimes what worked for that property doesn't work for this. And we definitely need to push and to push each other and see what's out there. And I think and I think it's important for companies to invest in resources to manage those relationships, and to spend that time to really cultivate that. So for me, I don't have that. I wish I did have more of a direct relationship with the inventor community right now, but mostly it's through licensing and licensees. But whenever we do see an inventor item, I know that that's always something that blows away everybody's like minds, and in the room we see it. So that's definitely something to encourage in my point of view.
Thank you. And Stephanie, just sort of asking you, I mean, you mentioned, which I think is a very valid observation earlier, about the importance of retail and retailers when we're talking about development and licensing. Thinking specifically about that innovation and creativity side, do you hear from the retail buyers and retailers that you kind of have contact with that they're kind of looking for new ideas? Is there a kind of an emphasis on having originality in development, and sort of talking around that point? How do you kind of embrace that sort of inventor community and getting fresh ideas into the process?
Yeah, I think so for us, and I know for retailers as well, the end goal is kind of coming up with a new idea, something that will make us and the retailer stand out from their competition. And so whether that new idea is coming from us as a licensor, or from a licensee, or from an inventor, that's the end goal. So from a personal side, I thrive on the creativity, and so the ideation point is the most exciting kind of part of the process, and getting an inventor's mind and kind of their idea generation on your property can open up totally new doors. And so, yeah, I feel like a retailer would be and are really on board with that. Also, they don't tend to, as long as the licensee is on board and the commercial side then fits for their costings, and that licensee is willing to collaborate, then the retailer kind of, I think that a lot of the time they're like, okay, well, great, you sort that out. As long as we've got the cost that we need, that's for you to deal with. And so, yeah, as long as the commercial side fits, and there's that idea there, then I think it's a really ideal work stream. And like Susie said as well, kind of opening up the door to those inventors is really crucial. And so what Mojo Nation do with their connectivity is really helpful for licensors and licensees, because it's not something, well, personally speaking, you know, I don't feel like I have an automatic connection to the inventor world, but you know, it's a really important link for us.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure Billy and Mojo Nation will be very happy with the pats on the back they're getting as well. But I think you're right; they have fostered a really good sort of network and community. But one question I was going to ask as we kind of reach the conclusion of our discussion is, obviously we're talking about toy and games, but we're also talking about the licensing world as a whole. Do you think, and I'll ask Jennifer this first, do you look outside of, I think the answer from you would be yes, but do you look outside the toy and game area in licensing for ideas and inspiration in terms of maybe some product trends, some consumer interests that maybe kind of can influence back the toy world? So for example, would you look at what people are doing in the apparel category and think, well, there's some really smart thinking there, we can learn from that? So just be interested in to sort of get a picture of from yourselves of, do you look at other areas of licensing for ideas for toy and games?
That's a great question. Yeah, we do look at all different product categories. So apparel and home goods and stationery and all that great stuff is something that we spend a lot of time on as well, especially I think when it comes to art. So, you know, we have Toy Story has been around for 25 years. So, you know, that's one brand I think that we're playing around with, you know, a little more. So for example, we recently launched a theme called Alien Remix, and it's something that we would never allow before the idea came. And the funny thing is, it came from within our studio store. We have like a little studio store that sells some exclusive, you know, unique product. But it came from a freelance illustrator, Jared Mariyama, and he just had fun with the aliens dressed up as Woody or Jesse or Sully, and it's kind of this, you know, blending of two worlds, you know, because we usually like to keep Toy Story and all the different film worlds separate, in that they're, you know, kind of unique, separate universes, and there's not really one universe, although many internet conspiracists will say that it's all one world. But when we saw that, for me, because of just the rules and guidelines we usually try to push towards for our licensees, I was like, whoa, this is really breaking the rules. But at the same time, it was so cute. You know, it was a stylized alien wearing these, you know, basically doing cosplay and wearing these really cute costumes of very recognizable Pixar characters. And there's a lot of discussion, a lot of like, should we be doing this and all this, but it's out there. And a lot of our licensees, a lot of our Disney friends were really excited about it. And so it started off as more of a soft lines opportunity. So more like apparel where it's really cute art style. But then, you know, we had some toy partners really interested in, well, can we do some collectibles, you know, based on this stylization? And Mattel, we were like, yeah, why not? And so we started with Mattel, but it's kind of blown up in a way where everyone's like never seen, you know, our characters in this light. First in this really cute stylized interpretation, but also in this hybrid mix of different films and different characters. So that was, you know, one great example of being inspired by what's happening out in different product categories and bringing that into the space for toys and games. There's also a game, I think, in development, but it was just something where we were, you know, we pushed the boundaries a bit, but allowed for really, you know, kind of unique innovation in that world.
That's a great example, and thank you for sharing it with us. And Susie, in your experience, would you look outside the toy and game world in the wider licensing world for ideas?
Oh my God, yes. Inspiration is everywhere. I think a great example of that at Mattel was there was a brainstorm during the time when Twilight was hitting its, cultural high. And, the cultural zeitgeist is really important. And when you can translate something that's happening at an older age that is so pervasive in culture that kids know it's happening, but they can't access it. And you can take that in a way to their age. So a brainstorm was happening for my scene at the time. And somebody said, why don't we do Dolls of the Undead? And a designer got that in their head and started drawing up all the characters from Monster High. And that's how Monster High came to be. It was absolutely a cultural kind of phenomenon that was happening. So it comes from everywhere. It also can come from some of the user-generated content around your brands. It's not just from other categories, but you can see where consumers are, on Etsy or, they're doing their own things with your brands. And you're like, oh my God, I didn't realize people needed cake toppers or wanted, you have something special. We used to say when you could see people making their own stuff on Etsy, and you could, in the days of Toys R Us, you could track failed searches. And if a property was coming up as a failed search, you knew that there was something special about that and that you should jump on it and start providing products. So you can get inspiration from everywhere. And I think some of the best things that have happened that have been phenomenons in the toy industry have come because they're connecting dots that no one expected.
Okay, thank you. And if I just turn to Stephanie, if you can give us your sort of take on that, because obviously you're overseeing licensing in all its forms. And then I think we'll kind of be wrapping things up, but I would say it's been really great insights from you all. But Stephanie, if you take that last question, and then we'll bring our chat to its conclusion.
Yeah, totally agree with Jen and Susie's kind of points there. For me, I think particularly around Halo partnerships and those sort of surprising collaborations that you wouldn't expect, but in hindsight are absolutely genius. I think there's been so many of those over the last few years. That's something that's really kind of come out, and the majority of properties, I'd say, are kind of expanding or are already well into that. I think taking partnerships out of the traditional licensing landscape into the wider consumer brand space has produced some really inspirational results. And for me, that's where kind of, I wish I'd thought of that, or that's so clever. That's for me where, I feel the most inspiration. But I think just to take it to a different angle as well, I think for us, it can also be really inspiring to get onto the level of our core audience. So in the case of our content, really looking at it from a child's eye view, listening to our consumer and fans, and kind of by looking at it from a child's eye view, you get a totally different take on what you perceive as an adult. And kind of, I've really connected with, I do remember that's how I felt when I was 7 and I read the book Matilda for the first time. And I think that's helped us to really connect with the various angles and themes of our stories, of which there are so many, and sometimes it's tricky to kind of to whittle it down to what to go for in licensing. And within that, we've found that humor, we know, is a huge element of Roald Dahl stories, but actually the area that we know children connect with the most. And so just keeping that in mind, keeping that sort of question at the forefront of your mind of that's great what you think, but what's your audience thinking? What's the child thinking when they're perceiving this? And just kind of, using them as the inspiration as well.
Okay, thank you. And I'd just like to say before we end, I think all of you have been very generous with your time and your insights. And I think, it's been really good to hear the practical kind of knowledge and examples that you've been able to impart. So I think it's, I'm sure the audience that are listening will be very grateful. And I appreciate your insights. And that brings us to the end of the Playing with Brands panel session for the Play Creators Conference. And Susie, Stephanie, and Jennifer, thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.